Some people think that Parliament is boring. Those people would be wrong, and they probably haven't spent much time there. Hello, and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host, and today we're taking a look at a book that pulls back the curtain on some of the crazier things that have happened in Canada's Parliament over the years. Some of them are stories that I've heard. Some of them, it turns out, are myths. The book is called Unparliamentary: Tales from Canada's Colourful Parliamentary Past. Charlie Feldman is the author. He's a longtime Hill worker on the nonpartisan side, not working with politicians, but around them, Charlie. And you've picked up some good stories, and you've also broken my heart by telling me that some of them are myths. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the one that you broke my heart on, because I've even had Stephen Harper tell this story to a group of journalists who were at 24 Sussex and saying, I think it was Tonda McCharles from the Toronto Star talking about, well, the decorum in the House isn't what it used to be. People are arguing all the time. And Prime Minister Harper said, well, you do know that the seats are 2 sword lengths apart for a reason, don't you? Tell me about this. This is a story that you tell in the book, because that story is told constantly. I think if it's not still told on the tour, it used to be told to all the school kids and, tourists showing up.
Yeah, this is the problem when you start digging behind stories that just sound maybe too good to be true. So, as the story goes, the government and opposition benches are chewed sword lengths apart to prevent dueling, and we're told that this practice harkens back to Westminster. The issue is that we have no evidence that that's why the distance is that. We have no real record of dueling MPs once upon a time, and in fact, Westminster has put out a publication more recently talking about they have lines on the floor saying that while it's popularly believed that it was to keep members apart from duels, this has no historical evidence. So what we know about the old Westminster is that it was actually a chapel, and the understanding is that the width was to allow a priest and 2 acolytes to sort of go up on the altar, and that's what the original distance was. In any event, Parliament, as you know, burned down in 1916. When they rebuilt it, there would have been no reason to keep that distance for dueling. So in short, we tell this story because we like to tell it, but we have no sort of historical evidence to say, yes, in fact, this is the reason this distance is put between those benches. But I'm with you. It's a fun one to tell, and I like the imagery. And there's all sorts of references to it in Hansard. I think it's one of those myths that once you hear it and it makes sense to you, and you kind of nod your head, then it's an easy one to retell. And sort of in doing the book and pulling back the curtain on a bunch of these tales, I was also disappointed to find out there might not be as much historical accuracy as I would like to some of the more fun Parliament stories.
Well, I mean, we should have known it wasn't true because, as you point out in the book, armor has been banned in Parliament, in the British Parliament, which we inherited. It's been banned since 1313. And
Yes.
weapons have long been banned. In fact, in Canada's Parliament in Ottawa, until the 2014 terrorist attack, the guards inside the parliamentary buildings were not armed.
That I didn't know. I was going to say I haven't looked into that history, but
The guys on the outside were armed. The guys on the
that's
inside
it. The guy on the
were
inside
not.
weren't. Okay. Yes. I mean, we've certainly seen some interesting, I would say, violence on the inside of the legislature. Luckily, not involving firearms, but involving some other things. So, not to jump ahead too far into the book, but for example, things thrown from the gallery that we might not expect, or fist fights between members. But luckily, the more extreme violence we've been shielded from, and certainly, I mean, the idea of Canadian MPs, in 1867 showing up with swords and that being a thing to worry about, it's just there's absolutely no basis for that.
The book is called Unparliamentary. Why? That's a phrase that the speaker will often use when somebody says something they shouldn't, right?
Yeah, so I wanted to take it a bit broader than that and also talk about things that you wouldn't associate with Parliament. So while a lot of it has to do with sort of incidents of decorum that would otherwise be unparliamentary, so obviously curse words and unparliamentary language we can think of, but also conduct between members like fistfights or like being drunk in your seat. I also wanted this book to talk about things you wouldn't associate with Parliament. So for example, the Library of Parliament having a subscription to Playboy once upon a time. And the story
I
there
did
is
not know
that
that.
Yeah, the copies would go missing, shockingly, and so the solution of then parliamentary librarian Eric Spicer was to put them in the rare book room, to which members had to sign in and out, and all of a sudden the theft stopped. So, just to say, there's all these sorts of little tales that you wouldn't think of when you think Parliament, and I wanted to capture them in one place.
Uh, We often hear that, oh, decorum's getting worse. Decorum's getting worse. As someone that started going to Parliament Hill full time. I've been watching it longer than that, but started going to Parliament Hill full time, watching the debates, sitting in the chamber, sitting in that press gallery above the speaker's chair that you write about. Um, I'm not sure that that's ever accurate. People just feel like it is. But I want to ask you, you tell a story about a Quebec Liberal MP named Eugene Fissett and the Liberal whip. So these are two Liberal MPs. This is in September 1930. And the second Liberal MP, the whip, is Pierre Francois Casgrain.
Mhm.
What happened between them that led to a black eye and a funny heckle from Prime Minister R.B. Bennett?
Oh my God. So, Mr. Fizet, I'm not totally sure how to say his name, but right, he complained about his seat in the chamber and was vociferously complaining apparently about the office space he had been allocated. And so, on the first day that Parliament opened in 1930, he gets into an altercation with the whip, and the whip punches him in the eye. And he is depicted in all the newspaper stories as basically sporting a black eye. His glasses go flying in the fracas. There's no evidence that as a result of that particular intervention, his office space changed or his seat location changed.
I'm going to
But
doubt
we're
that it did.
yeah, no, it's a funny thing to think that that's how you would respond to that kind of complaint, and I should say it didn't stop the political career of the whip, who I think later becomes a lieutenant governor of a province, so and maybe even became speaker if I'm not mistaken. All that to say, though, the retort is an interesting one because later we see the prime minister making a reference to the incident. So Vizet is up again complaining about something, and the prime minister basically says, I think we can all understand better now the incident of the other day, which is clearly a reference to him getting a black eye. This is one of those interesting things that Hansard didn't capture, that is the black eye incident. And part of that is we're not quite sure whether they were going to the Senate for the throne speech or just come back from it. But Hansard wouldn't necessarily capture a moment like that. You're not going to see, editor's note member walked over and got punched in the face. And it's the newspaper reporters in the gallery who saw it happen who bring this story to life. There's interviews with other members. So that's how we know that this happened. But certainly, if we're talking about how decorum has changed over time, I'm happy to say that no MP has recently been seen in the chamber with a black eye as a result of speaking to another MP, particularly a member of their own caucus.
It was described in a newspaper at the time as a fistic encounter on the floor of the chamber of the House of Commons. So, as you say, were they in session or not? We don't know. But I've never looked at how Hansard captured elbowgate, which is
Mm.
when Justin Trudeau got impatient that the Conservatives. So he's newly elected prime minister. The NDP and the Conservatives don't want to get to a particular vote. I forget what the vote was, but I watched this live, and Trudeau gets so fed up with them dilly-dallying that he walks down through the chamber to where Gord Brown for the Conservatives is talking with some New Democrat colleagues, and he grabs Brown by the elbow, uh, and drags him to his seat. And while doing so, as he turns, Trudeau elbows the breast of New Democrat Ruth Ellen Brosseau. I've never looked at how Hansard captured that fracas, but we do know that it led to a colorful incident for the PM.
Yes, I can disappoint you by telling you exactly how Hansard captures it on that particular day. And that is that, the speaker says, call in the members. That's right before a vote. And then we see in the English Hansard, it says, before the taking of the vote, the speaker, I will hear the honorable member on a brief point of order or question of privilege, whatever it is. And then we have the discussion of what happened. So the actual conduct itself doesn't get any sort of specific line in Hansard. It's the people talking about it right after. And that's one of the interesting things about Hansard and heckling and all this stuff. So now we have a convention, for example, if someone's heckled, but there's no response to it, it doesn't do anything for the debate, the actual text of the heckle won't be recorded. Whereas in the past, you'd often see a lot of these interjections and brackets and whatnot. So it sort of depends on how much impact it has in the debate day. In that particular case, though, you can certainly understand what had happened given all the discussion that follows and all the various apologies. And so that sort of puts together it. But yeah, it is a funny thing sometimes reading Hansard and think, I must have missed something. What is it that actually happened in there? And there's a story in the book about someone throwing from the gallery something you would not expect, namely their feces, and it just says in the Hansard basically, and a disturbance occurring or something like that. And then it's a discussion after where even members are not quite saying what it is. I believe the first member refers to it as a quote object of attack has been thrown from the gallery, and it's again the press reporting that rounds out that in fact someone had come in with their own poop and had taken a throw, and it landed unfortunately all over a backbencher who had nothing to do with anything the person was concerned about. So there are interesting things that are in Hansard and then sometimes not in Hansard.
So in the book, you talk about a few incidents of fighting. We're not quite like the parliament, where is it Taiwan, where they get into big
Yes.
fist fights? We're not
Hmm.
quite like that. But
No.
one MP did tell another, I believe it was a conservative to a liberal, meet me in room 13. I don't even know where room 13 is, and I had my office there for years. So tell me the story about uh, Arthur Bunster and Guillaume Cheval.
Right. So Arthur Bunster was a Vancouver MP who is said to be a brewer of beer out west and a brewer of trouble in Ottawa. And he might have been a bit of a belligerent generally. So one day he's giving a speech and there's a lot of noise in the chamber coming from the other side. And by noise, we mean some kind of musical interlude. We're not sure if it's a member attempting to imitate a cat, if there's in fact some kind of squeaking toy that he has. In any event, Mr. Bunster asks for the card of the bugger and is told that it's Guillaume Chevalier Saint Jacques. And he gives him a note back saying, meet me in room 13. Now,
So
this is in
they
the
were
old.
sending notes via the pages? He didn't just stand up and say, "Meet me in room 13," like that they sent a note for it?
I understand it was a note sent, yeah. And so we're in the old Parliament building pre-fire. So, and unfortunately, there are no interior pictures of sort of committee rooms from that time. I was digging my best in the archive to try to find one. We have the chamber from that period, the foyer from that period, but we don't have room 13. In any event, what happens in that room, a little bit of a discrepancy in the reporting. Either Mr. Bunster is there with a knife waiting for Mr. Cheval, or just punches start flying, or Prime Minister Johnny MacDonald is there with some other conservatives and like, they're not going to fight. Let's get out of here. What we know happens at some point is punches start flying. And we know that Mr. Bunster has Mr. Cheval in a headlock. And to get out of it, Cheval rips out a portion of Mr. Bunster's beard. We're then told in most reporting that he runs through the Commons parading it like a trophy. And so it's sort of the beard pull around Ottawa. Now, Mr. Bunster, many years later, is asked about a patch on his beard. So we know kind of implicitly from that definitely there was a mark left. And he basically said, no, I got it back. And he must have had some mattress stuffing that he was parading around the Commons. Believe that is if you'd like. But yes, we have this great evidence of a full-on fight between the two involving a beard ripping.
It's fascinating to hear these stories because at one point you reference how in Nova Scotia, as Nova Scotia was considering whether to join Confederation, uh, there were people warning, no, you don't want to join them. All they do is they have fist fights all day and they're all drunk. Was there a lot of
Mm-hmm.
drinking and fist fighting in pre-Confederation parliaments in uh, the upper and lower Canada?
Yes, this is a fun history for a number of reasons, but yes, we know that the drinking was rampant. Fistfights we have reports of here and there. I mean, there's a great article on the early days in Ontario where actually a problem was members getting up to speak and dying mid-speech, which I understand the Hansard in one case just says, and the member thereupon expiring, and then moves on to the next. So, very, very dry way to report that. But yes, they were drinking, and so the actual Nova Scotia incident you're mentioning comes days after reports that basically members were sort of throwing pamphlets and books at one guy. They wanted to stop talking. And obviously, alcohol was suggested to be a part of that. But the antics in those early days were quite something. They used to have a practice of putting little paper hats on members who were sleeping. And then it would be this big game of making as much noise when the person would finish speaking, to sort of see where the hat would fall when the sleeping member was awoken by all the ruckus in the chamber. So very, schoolboy, but nonetheless, quite fun. We do have some more grave, I think, disorder because of drinking, including a member who walks in and is sort of waving his cane around and threatening to fight everybody, and we're told that he's removed by the attendants. We also have a story that's maybe a bit on the lighter side of a member who mid-speech stopped his speech. And from sort of the read of it, you would seem that he went to get a glass of water. We're told what actually happened was someone subbed out his water glass for something a little bit stronger, and this member, sort of in the middle of his oration, didn't know, and so he reached down and took a glass of whiskey instead, and then was quickly in a panic trying to get it out and to have some water. Unfortunately, by giving up his speaking slot, he wasn't able to resume, and the speaker had very, very little sympathy. What I like about that story, though, is if you think about the chamber, someone coming from across the chamber would be very obvious and in the line of sight. So I'm thinking it was someone sitting near him. So probably someone in his own caucus thwarted his speech. But we're told that the entire house was in stitches when that happened.
There's all kinds of legends about drinking and debauchery on the Hill. Is it true that they used to have both a bar and a jail in the House of Commons?
So the bar is definitely true. We have a lot of evidence of the bar under Center Block, and at the time, the Senate had a restaurant and wine room, and so there were all these shenanigans about trying to portray something publicly, particularly during Prohibition, about Parliament being dry, when in fact that wasn't really the case. In one era, what they did was made the rule that you couldn't have a drink while standing, and therefore they could say it was a restaurant that they had and not a bar because you couldn't be served alcohol standing up. But yes, we are told that it was quite the place, and in fact, for many years, the big problem was Ottawa locals going up to the Hill because the bar there was open later than anywhere else in the city because they thought the city rules didn't apply for them. And members had all sorts of complaints about the strangers coming in and sometimes then roaming the hall and taking things out of members' offices. So it was a wild time when the bar existed. And there's various times when the speaker says, "Oh, it's closed," or they've shifted things around. But we have enough accounts to understand that they basically just went downstairs and drank their faces off, and then would occasionally come back to vote. In terms of the jail, though, this is one of the more, I don't know, kind of rumors that we would like to believe, but we have no evidence of a jail cell in the old Parliament building. It's not on the floor plans that we had. We don't have anything from the Sergeant at Arms saying that it was used as the jail. In fact, the rare time that we've had somebody in custody, the Sergeant at Arms has said, "Oh, I just took them to my own office," and sort of that doubled as a jail. It is true that there was, jail cell in the UK, that the parliaments in Victoria actually had a room that was designed as a jail cell. They never had any prisoner there. And if you go to the parliament in Melbourne, Australia, there is also what was once a jail cell, but it's not true to say that we had one. We had rooms that were used for that purpose, of course, when we had someone in custody, but they were just the Sergeant at Arms office.
The you open, or towards the beginning of the book, at least, you're writing about Sir John A. Macdonald and a famous incident that may not be true, like a lot of the things that we hear. And it's about him being in the middle of a speech or a debate. Accounts vary, and he throws up in the middle of it, but then quickly recovers. Tell us about that story, but also speak to the overall issue that I think McDonald's drinking, which at one point was apparently bad, and then it became quite sober.
Mm,
He had lost his wife, he had lost a lot of things when he had
yeah.
his dark period. Um, but is McDonald's drinking overall exaggerated in folklore?
Gosh. Okay. So to start with the story, we have this tale that basically McDonald throws up, and some other person says, how can you support this drunk either in office or this guy? I can't believe you're going to elect this guy. And McDonald says, well, it's not the drink, it's the other guy's policies that make me sick to my stomach, or whenever I see his face, I can't resist the urge to vomit. Some sort of variation on that theme. And we're told that the crowd at the time went wild, and that thing swung in McDonald's favor. And so the problem with this is we're told either it's various electoral contexts that it happens. We're sometimes told that, in fact, it was in the House of Commons that this happened. All roads on that story lead to an 1894 biography where the guy writing it says, I was working on a book on Sir John A.'s life, but he just died, and my publisher says you have 5 weeks to finish it, and so I did the best I could. And in that, we have no sort of evidence that this particular thing happened the way we'd like to believe it happened, and we have newspaper accounts of all these different rallies at which John A. appeared. We obviously have our Hansard and Parliamentary reporters, and I cannot find anywhere the line, he threw up and in such a public way, or that this was the particular retort. And I did reach out to the Parks Canada people running the John A. Macdonald site at Bellevue House in Kingston. They're like, yeah, there's a lot of rumors. We have no evidence of this either. So in terms of his drinking, we do know it was a problem. We understand at one point even there was a sort of the Fenian raids happening, and he was just so drunk he couldn't give any sort of direction on what to have happen for quite some time. He was out of contact, I think, with some of the way it was phrased at the time. There's a lot of interesting press reporting around it. That said, I think the issue is that George Brown, who was his primary opponent in many of the elections, was a teetotaler. And so the contrast between the two was seized on by the press. There's a lot of editorial cartoons about John A. Macdonald's drinking. In fact, in some, he is sort of depicted as the beer bottle, just to illustrate how much he drank.
Would any of those appear in George Brown's Globe and Mail? Perchance.
Yes, exactly. And this is part of the challenge, right? Even looking in old newspapers, there was a time when they were quite clearly partisan organs. And so even trying to reconcile reports. So going back to the issue of fistfights, sometimes you read two stories on the same fistfight, and depending on the political allegiance of the newspaper, you determine that the victor was a different person. And so it makes it very difficult to reconcile. And I'd say that issue is actually particularly pronounced if it's an Anglophone and Francophone. Sometimes the French press reports quite favorably on the Francophone. The English does its side as well. So all that to say, we know that John A. Macdonald loved the bottle. It does seem that at points it's exaggerated in certain media outlets, but the story of him sort of vomiting mid-speech and having this great turn, we just don't have any evidence that happened. So we'd like to believe it. It still comes up in papers to this day. And every time I read it, sort of shake my head and think, did you bother to fact check that? Where did you get it from? But I think much like the two sword length thing, it's just we've heard the story so much and you can find it so many places, and we just like to believe it's true. So we repeat it without questioning it.
All right. We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk about, one man who became prime minister due to fisticuffs and putting a salmon in your trousers. That's not a euphemism. Back in moments. But first, we've got merch from hoodies to hats to tote bags, mugs, and more. You can now shop the official Post Media store. You can get National Post gear, Toronto Sun gear, your favorite local Post Media paper. It's a bold way to show your love for fearless journalism, and it looks good too. Visit postmedia.store to shop the collection today. That's postmedia.store.
You're a political junkie, right? That's why you're listening to this podcast.
But if you're not in the loop with Post Media's VIP political hack, then you're not getting even close to the whole politics story.
I'm Stuart Thompson, Parliamentary Bureau Chief.
And I'm political analyst Tasha Carradine.
We head up the team that brings Political Hack members the exclusive political intel that goes so much deeper than the news, with inside stories, sharp analysis, and behind-the-scenes scoops from Parliament Hill and beyond.
With our twice-weekly newsletters, exclusive reports from Washington, D.C., early access to John Ivison columns, and subscriber-only videos and events, Hack members get insider insight into the minds of the strategists, policy gurus, and power brokers shaping Canada's political future.
You don't want to miss all that, do you?
I sure don't. And you can get all now for less than $1 a week. Just go to nationalpost.com/newsletters to sign up.
That's nationalpost.com/newsletters.
So much is happening in politics right now. rising tensions with the U.S. on trade and defense.
Not one, but two provincial separatist movements gaining real ground.
The Liberals trying to hang on to a razor-thin majority as the economy stumbles and with the cost of living still rising.
It's exciting.
Extremely exciting.
But the only way to get behind the scenes and right into the source code of what politicians and the people around them are really thinking is to get political hack.
Go to nationalpost.com/newsletters.
And join us.
I'm going to recommend the book once again, Charlie, because it is the type of book you can just leave on your coffee table, and if you've got people interested, or the bathroom, some people still do that. It's the type of thing that you can pick up and just read a quick tidbit, and it's fun and entertaining. So I'm recommending this for politicos. Yeah, look, Christmas is coming, and lots of books given as gifts at Christmas. But let's talk about the PM that became prime minister by beating up an Aboriginal man, Justin Trudeau. You talk a little bit about the what'd you call it? The thrilla on the hilla. I was there for an awful lot of that boxing match between Justin Trudeau and Patrick Brazeau. I was the ringside play-by-play guy for the TV broadcast.
Really?
Maybe we used that. I can't remember.
I found that in press reporting, and I'll just say there's some pictures in the book, about 40 in total. And when I did the first draft to the publisher, I had about 110, and most of them fell away for copyright reasons. But there was one particular photo from the weigh-in where I believe it's Mr. Brazeau in basically a Speedo, and sort of Justin Trudeau sort of pointing in that general direction with a shocked expression. I thought, ooh, this is the picture I want. But I will just say, I'll give a plug to Post Media because I think it was actually their photo. So the battle there was for charity. It was a boxing match, and Mr. Trudeau took it, I think, in the, I want to say, third round, but you did the play-by-play, so you could tell me better. But it's not the only time we've seen members pick up boxing gloves. There were members threatening to fight all throughout Canadian history. We have some great examples of people saying, take it outside in the lobby, and then either the sergeant at arms breaking it up, or members finally getting cooler senses when other members sort of intervened and pulled them away. But yes, so it's a well-celebrated moment where Justin Trudeau takes on Patrick Brazeau. And when Justin Trudeau stepped down as being PM, Brazeau tweeted that he basically thought it would maybe time for a rematch again for charity. To my knowledge, that hasn't happened. My money is on if it does happen. I think they should have Katy Perry doing the anthem, just really make this a full spectator event if they're going to do it. But
I can tell you that for the now defunct Sun News Network, that was our highest rated show ever, because we got the rights. Yes, we helped turn it into the spectacle that it was. We got the rights, and it was a massive audience, and bars were showing it, and people were gathering to watch. Not something you would normally think of, but it helped propel Trudeau into the Prime Minister's office. Let's talk about fish in your trousers. Pants, for people that don't remember what the word trousers means. October 16th, 1985, Hansard has an editor's note that says, whereupon Mr. Fulton crossed the floor and placed a salmon on the Prime Minister's desk.
An all-time classic in Hansard, I have to say. Sometimes you just get a line and you're like, all right, there we go, this happened.
So I've seen props over the years. I've never seen a fish pulled out, and especially you did the digging, and it looks like he smuggled the 12-pound salmon in his pants?
Yeah,
that's a big salmon.
Have you seen the video? If not, I will send it to you. It is a good one. And so you see him say, why should it be illegal to possess? And you hear this sort of metal click as he pulls sort of the fish from basically a hook on a rope. And it's illegal to possess salmon. And funnily enough, as sort of you hear the exclamation in the chamber, you clearly hear someone say, holy mackerel, which I thought was funny because it's a salmon. But in any event, I digress.
Then he... fun.
Right, and then he walks across the chamber, and unfortunately, the camera then cuts to the speaker, so we don't see the exact sequence of events. But we're told basically he waves it in the government house leader's face, and then puts it down on the prime minister's desk. Now, I'm saying puts it there because some newspapers say throws, slaps, hits. But the degree of force with which it hits the prime minister's desk, I don't know, and the video doesn't tell us. But the reason behind it, and we should say there is a reason, is that there was a salmonoid enhancement project. So the government did all these modifications on salmon, and it was very successful. The problem is they couldn't let the salmon go upstream and be caught because it would affect ecosystem things. So he was upset because a lot of fishers in his constituency couldn't make as much money as they would have been able to have these other salmon been released. And so he'd asked a few questions and was pestering the government and got nowhere. And I think decided, okay, I need to be dramatic and actually bring the fish in. We're told that at least he replaced the blotter on the prime minister's desk. And I probably should note that the prime minister was absent that day attending a Commonwealth conference in the Caribbean. So he didn't get the full, wet and bloodied fish.
That would be the Commonwealth conference, I believe, where Brian Mulroney convinced the other heads of state to push hard against apartheid in South Africa. So he was doing something good while he missed the salmon.
Yes. And we're told he has a salmon back in time for a press conference in the foyer. And just because I'm a nerd and like these things, there's conflicting reports on whether it was the clerk or a page who removed a fish. But I have to imagine that in terms of your, CV responsibilities, taking out a fresh fish from the chamber has to be somewhere under other duties as required. But yes, we've seen plenty of props used over the years. I just really like the fish for that sort of the visual you get, as well as the awkwardness of that Hansard intervention to tell us that in fact he crossed the floor carrying a salmon.
What's your favorite story from the book? From all the crazy things that you've looked into, which one is your favorite?
So the one I enjoy talking about the most is the parliamentary genital exam. And that is mostly because when you say that phrase, people just look at you like you're crazy. And so it lets you talk about an interesting time in Canadian history when if you wanted a divorce, you had to go to Parliament. And so you would go with a private bill petition, and you had to pay money, and you'd hang it on the door of the Senate. And believe it or not, parliamentary divorce lasted until 1969 in some spots of Canada. And for a while, it was the bulk of the Senate's workload. But the year of this story is 1888, when Mary Matilda White of Port Dover, Ontario, comes to Parliament for a divorce. And unlike everyone who'd been before her who said it's adultery, and here's what he did, basically, she says, in fact, he has impotence and he's unable to consummate the relationship. And so the question for the Standing Committee on Divorce is, what do we do? In the cases that involved adultery, they would hear evidence. So witnesses would come forward and say things like, I saw him leaving her house, at 2 a.m. with his hat off his head in the carriage. And you wonder, well, why are you staring at her house at 2 a.m.? But that's a whole other story. And in fact, there was fraud at the time, and some people went to jail for basically trying to collude to convince Parliament to grant a divorce. So the committee decides, well, we need evidence of the particular allegation that he's never been able to consummate this relationship because of some, I believe the phrase she uses is frigidity or malformation of the parts, end quote. And so we understand that the senators decide that 2 senators who have medical degrees should take a look. And they indeed examine the man. This is where we get another twist in the story, is that we're told by press reportings that the man is a quote-unquote dwarf, to use the word from the time. So if you don't have dwarf genital exam on your parliamentary bingo card, there you go. And he says basically... Exam. Yeah, and so he basically says, listen, it's in working order. It may not be the, scale you're used to, but it's fine. The problem is her. This is where the story takes a turn because we understand that they look at her and decide that her petition is not proven. So if you're sort of trying to think between the lines, basically, if she's alleging her marriage has never been consummated, they expect her to look a certain way, which she did not. I should again stress this is 1888, and we have very different ideas now about how you might test virginity and whatnot. And so they basically say, well, you're not getting your divorce, go home, back to the guy that now every paper in the country has reported on your allegations. The story doesn't end there in 2 respects. The first is that there's a huge debate in the Senate about printing the evidence because apparently it leaks into the hands of the public and is seen in the hands of a boy of only 12 summers. And so senators are upset and worried about being charged with obscenity and just what this means that, should the clerk, whoever leaked it, be charged with a offense. And they're the great Senate debate on just the sort of, you can read through the squeamishness that they all have about the topic. And ultimately, they pass a motion to burn the remaining evidence. So we unfortunately don't have a copy of it other than the little bits that are in press reporting. And we know, unfortunately, that anything that would have remained behind would be lost in the fire of 1916. But the story doesn't end there. There's a little coda to it that happens in a local paper where we're basically told that the guy who helped pay for her petition might have been seeing her on the side. And we know that at one point he shows up on her front step and shoots the husband in the face. So a lot was happening in 1888. But for my purposes, it is the parliamentary genital exam that I think we would just all like to pretend didn't happen. And luckily has not been repeated as far as anyone knows.
Oh man, shot him in the face.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of sexy scandals in Canadian politics, though. There's been accusations, and you write about this. I was there for it, that a certain male member of parliament was watching pornography while in the house, and he denied it and explained, "No, I was showing photos from of me and my girlfriend on vacation at the beach."
Yeah.
And uh, but there was the Munsinger affair. Is that really
Mm.
Canada's only sex scandal involving members of parliament in a tawdry way, you might say?
I'm going to say that's the only one that we really know about. Right? I'm
I'm
sure
going to
there's
say
other
that there's been
stories.
an awful lot of more hanky-panky going on Parliament Hill than we know about. But the Munsinger affair, this is a woman from West Germany suspected of being a KGB agent, and she slept with several of Diefenbaker's cabinet ministers.
Right. So we know one for sure, Associate Defense Minister Pierre Sévigny, and there's discussion of others, perhaps George He's. In the days where this scandal broke, it really wasn't clear just how much of the cabinet had been compromised. And it seems that this was well known in Ottawa for a bit between sort of the two parties, and then it breaks loose in question period with a sort of an errant mention of her name.
But
Um,
years later, it
Years
didn't
later,
break when it
yeah.
was happening. It broke when it was all done.
No, this is something I like is sort of the Canadian politeness, I think. You know, we might all know someone is having some kind of affair or something, and yet we're like, well, it's not really, a matter for the public. We're still, in a way that I think if it happened in the U.S., it would be out in the open right away. But all that to say, so yes, we have then a commission of inquiry that looks into all these sorts of things to figure out who knew what when. Were any members compromised further? Did information get back to the Soviets? I mean, it's a fascinating story, in part just for all the bizarre little twists and turns. So, for example, when the member makes the first allusion to it in question period, he gets the name wrong, and that sends journalists down rabbit holes, and they're told this woman dies. Then the Toronto Star happens to track her down in Germany and has a whole interview with her saying, in fact, she's alive, and here you go. Years later, there's a scandal when CBC interviews her for her reflections on it all, in which she basically says, look, I was a young girl. I like to go to parties. I met some men in politics, but it's not at all, as bad as they all make it out to be. But certainly it was a wild scandal, particularly in the early days where it was suggested that, in fact, she'd had relations with multiple members of the cabinet. And so, yeah, I think it's obligatory in Canadian parliamentary history that you talk about that particular scandal. But certainly there are others involving, people not necessarily being faithful. But I think in terms of like a real sex scandal, the fact that it involves sex and spying is what I think tips
Yeah,
that one in our favor of being interesting.
the only recent one I can think of is Maxime Bernier left his briefing binder at the home of his girlfriend who had previously dated some bikers. Uh,
Yeah,
that's the Julie Couillard issue. That pales in comparison to, well, she might be a KGB spy.
I just to say my Julie Couillard story. This is just a very random aside, just because on the Hill and a random claim to fame. I was at the throne speech, and I had a friend with me who jokingly we said, "Let's see who can get more pictures of more cabinet ministers." We thought it would just be a funny thing to do, when you're young on the Hill or whatever. And so I saw Mr. Bernier, and I said, "Oh, can we take a picture?" And he says, "Oh yeah," and basically beckons this person over, and I had no idea who she was. And so I have a selfie with Maxime Bernier and Julie Couillard, and then months later, this story breaks. And I think I posted on Facebook, and someone's like, "Do you realize who you're in this photo with?" And anyhow, just to say, it's very very random life on the Hill, but that certainly took a lot of headlines for the fact that he might have left some documents, the security risks of which I think we still don't quite know. It didn't seem like they were that, like they might have been classified one thing, but whether they were really that important, I don't think we have clarity on. But yeah, we don't get many good sex scandals, I have to say. Not that I'm asking politicians to go out of their way to have them. Just, if I want to write a second edition, I need fodder for it.
You mentioned Daryl Stinson, and reminded me of some interesting stories. He has since passed, former MP. But when he was leaving Parliament, he made a comment about cigarettes. Tell us that story. What was he getting at there?
Well, so at the time, parliamentarians like to smoke. I mean, let's just be blunt about it. There's plenty of pictures of MPs, enjoying a little puff outside center block. And as societal attitudes on smoking changed, he was in the camp of, let's be honest about what you're doing. And so he was talking about how often when journalists would come to take pictures, other members would have him as smokes. And he says that he has basically photos of him with like 10 cigs in his hands because he's holding them for other members. And he's like, if you're lying about that, what else are you lying about? With his shot at other MPs. The end of the smoking era on the Hill is a really interesting one. The book talks about MP Lynn McDonald, who was allergic to cigarette smoke and sort of made it her life's mission to make the Hill smoke free. And we're told this involves a lot of smashing of ashtrays and sort of getting up in other members' faces
They
and
used
being
to smoke
belligerent.
in the chamber, didn't they?
Yeah. And in fact, there's even Georges-Étienne Cartier in the earliest days gets up on a point of order and says, if members wouldn't mind, please don't smoke in the chamber and just go to the smoking room. And they had a smoking room in Parliament. There's a pencil sketch in the book that we have from an old archive because it was notorious, sort of the backroom deals happening in this smoke-filled space. And the senators, for their part, I should say, had this great snuff box that sat on the clerk's table, and we're told that it was tradition basically before you gave a speech to go up and smoke a little bit and basically cough it out before you got to your oration. Yeah, so Stinson's point was basically, if you're going to be honest about, you should be honest about your smoking habit if in fact you have one. I should say we also even have some great stories from MPs of days when they used to send the pages to get them smoked from the cigarette vending machine in the cafeteria, just to really place that one in time. And certainly we can all imagine the shenanigans going on in that era.
That was before my day. I also missed out on what was known as the blind pig, which after they got rid of the bar in the House of Commons, people would come to the hot room, which is where a lot of journalists had desks. If you didn't have your own full bureau on the outside, you had a desk in the hot room like I did for many years. And just prior to me getting there, they got rid of the blind pig, which was you could go in and there was a vending machine for beer. And you could also buy those little airplane bottles of hard liquor. And in fact, there was the tube system for sending messages, and they could ship them across under the ground, across to the Prime Minister's office, and civil servants or politicians would sometimes send the money in one tube with a note of what they wanted, and it would go back in the other tube.
I have heard so many great stories about the blind pig, and there's fascinating press reporting on it. And it's suggested in some that, in fact, this was the speaker's way of resolving the impasse where members wanted booze on the Hill but couldn't be seen to sort of have it. And so the solution was, well, let's put it in the press gallery. And we have some great interviews with former heads of the press gallery talking about just how much beer they would purchase. I think one said there's 80 cases a month at one point that they would go through. And so, yeah, it's a fascinating history.
Lester
And
Pearson, if he was in center block on a Saturday night and there were people in the hot room, he would drop by for a beer and watch Hockey Night in Canada.
There you go. I mean, there's so many untold stories of the Hill, I have to be honest. So one of the constraints on this book was I wanted to use things which are publicly sourced. And then in the process of telling people you're writing this, they tell you all these other stories that have no, but public-facing element. But the shenanigans that people got up to when they were drunk is legend. I will tell you, by the way, one of my favorite stories. It's not in the book and not alcohol-based, but just one of the cleanest pranks I've ever heard of involves a member who had an identical twin brother. And one day, the identical twin comes to Ottawa to surprise his brother, just sort of a friendly family thing. And immediately the press starts hounding him and asking him all these questions. He's like, no, it's not me. It's not me. And I gather he sort of shows the driver's license. And they're like, oh, we didn't know, he had an identical twin brother. And they're like, yeah. And the journalists agree, listen, how about we pull a little prank on him? We'll tell him you're holding a press conference in Center Block and sort of we'll send a page in to say, hey, your brother's pretending to be you and doing a press conference. So they're like, yeah. So they get a bunch of their friends together. They're in Center Block in the Rotunda and the identical twins sort of hang around. They send the note in. This poor page goes in. It's the note, your brother's pretending to be you giving a press conference. And as we're told, you could just hear the running as this member's like leaping over people to get to Center Block. And as soon as sort of there's wind of it, the identical twin who's in front of the press starts spouting off something wild. That's why we're going to colonize Mars and put the opposition there, whatever it is. And we're basically told the MP tackles his brother, just full on jumps on him and it starts wringing his neck and then realizes he's in front of a whole bunch of journalists who are about to photograph him choking a constituent and sort of pulls back. And we're told the press uproariously laughed at this prank. And I just love it for how clean it is. And the reason it's not in the book is just because it's not publicly sourced, but I know it happened. I can tell you why I know it happened. The MP told me. So I can tell you, I have it on really good authority. But I just love, that kind of tale that, we just otherwise wouldn't know.
Let's end on a positive note. It's not all fisticuffs. I mentioned Daryl Stinson a moment ago with that so many cigarettes in his hand story. He ended up needing cancer treatment. And in 2005, when it was Paul Martin's minority government, things were very tense and he could have cast a deciding vote, but he couldn't be at the House. He could not be in the chamber due to his cancer treatment. The Liberals actually pulled someone for that, didn't they?
Yeah. You're catching me right off guard because I can't remember the name of the person, but we have a lot of great stories of collaboration and compromise. I mean, one story that I'm fond of telling is actually during World War I, there was an MP who was a prisoner of war. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and was taken to basically a German prison. And it happened that there was an election during that period and all the other parties agreed not to stand anybody against him. So he won by acclamation as sort of solidarity from MPs. We have a lot of great tales like that throughout our history of sort of the humanity of MPs helping each other out. And, while the book was focused on the frivolous and sort of ridiculous or weird stuff.
But they're fun stories.
But they're fun stories, yeah. But it's not to diminish the fact that they're human, and in that you have the full range from the serious to the very silly, and there's some beautiful poignant moments in Canadian parliamentary history as well that go under the radar sometimes. And so agreeing to pull somebody to help in recognition of someone's medical treatment, I mean, that just speaks to sort of the integrity that parliamentarians can have, even though I realize I focused on some of the moments where the integrity might not be where we quite want it to be.
All right. Again, can't recommend the book enough. Unparliamentary: Tales from Canada's Colourful Parliamentary Past. The author, Charlie Feldman. Charlie, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please make sure you hit subscribe, share this on social media, tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
There were so many missed opportunities to catch this before the devastating thing happened.
A third of them we found literally in the phone book. These people were not afraid. They knew that nobody was effectively hunting them. They knew they had escaped justice, that they were going to die in their beds.
When I give talks at law schools, is that the charter ultimately is empowering a minority, and it's empowering a minority that's a guild across the country. And it's a fairly elite guild, and the guild is lawyers.
Families who were split by referendum and brothers and sisters who never talked to each other for years after the referendum because they were so angry at each other because of emotions on both sides.
The reason he was assassinated was not because he was trying to put a satellite into space, but because the gun that he was creating had other applications that made him and the gun very dangerous.
It's finally here. A new season of Canada Did What? Post-media podcast that revisits the big Canadian political events you might think you remember,
and tells you the real story you never knew. I'm Tristan Hopper. The voices you just heard are from our brand new Season 2. We will unpack some of the pivotal moments that helped define our country, often without a vote, usually without a plan, and sometimes without anyone admitting what they'd done. We'll find out how Canada became a welcoming paradise for untold numbers of Nazi war criminals after the Second World War. We let them build monuments to their wartime exploits and even ended up honoring a Nazi fighter in the House of Commons. And I'm sorry to say that none of that happened by accident. We'll bring you the little-known story of a troubled Canadian rocket scientist who turned to a sinister life of selling giant guns to terrible people. And if that sounds like a spy novel, it ends like one too. You'll hear the behind-the-scenes story of Quebec's attempted secession from Canada and how very close we came to a political crisis that would have made Brexit look like a picnic. You'll hear about how the much-celebrated Charter of Rights and Freedoms turned into something its creators never wanted, and how many of the most extravagant warnings about the document were all quickly proven true. And you'll even hear about how authorities bungled multiple chances to stop the deadliest terrorist attack in our country's history, and then proceeded to pretend it never happened. These aren't dusty history lessons. They're stories about power, ambition, madness, and the things about Canada that a lot of people would rather ignore. But not you. You won't want to miss an episode. Subscribe to make sure you get all of Season 2 starting March 2026, anywhere you get your podcasts.